Good morning, everyone, and welcome to 1 Peter 4, blah, 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 such a journey, blah, blah, wonderful chapter, blah, blah, what a blessing, and all the other things that we've said every devotional, every morning. I had to tell you, it's so hard to intro these every day, unless you're Mike Van Meter. He just looks up to the camera and says, 1 Peter 4, I hope you read it, and then he goes and do it like a boss. And I have to tell you, I really like that about Mike. Are you ready to get into chapter 4 and start unpacking it? I know I am. The first two verses of this chapter are powerful, sobering, and convicting. What Peter says in these two verses is for those who really want to be followers and not just call themselves followers. This is the difference between converts and disciples. It's one of those true tests of what you believe. Now, if you like your life the way that it is without any hardship or persecution of any kind, stop watching this right now. Turn it off, because Peter's about to give it to us real. No sugarcoating, no soft serve, just heavy truth. So this is your warning. But remember, you can't fully share in his blessings if you don't share with his persecutions. So let's read the first two verses of Peter chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. It says this. He starts off, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also for that same purpose, to suffer with him in the flesh. Because the one who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human lusts, but for the will of God." And in here, Peter is just boldly magnifying what Jesus had already said in John 15, verses 18 through 20. And I'd like to read that. I think it is important. He says, if the world, Jesus is talking, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teachings, they will obey yours as well. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. The American Christian spends way more time worrying about being persecuted than they do worrying about not being persecuted. The truth is that the only thing worse than being persecuted is actually not being persecuted. It means the world no longer hates us because, well, we've become just like the world. It does not hate its own. Peter says that since Christ suffered, we should arm ourselves for that same purpose, to stand for what the world hates, but for what the Lord loves. Then Peter says that the one who does this will cease from sin. That's a weird thing to say. But he does not mean that that person will become sinless, but rather that sin will lose its power to defeat us in our sufferings when we focus on Christ and what he has done for us. The problem is that many of us will do anything to avoid pain. We hide from it when it presents itself. We will do anything to avoid conflict, including ignoring convictions to fit the social norms of the moment. We would rather live with all the hurt and pain that has come into our lives over the years than meet with a mentor or counselor and work through those hurts. I mean, we even point fingers and blame others so that there will be no pressure of fault on us. This is completely human. But the trick is to remember what you suffer for Christ. He suffered here on earth for one purpose, us. When we suffer, we enter into his love and help, and we suffer for his name, and we glorify him. And when we suffer, we don't do it alone. We do it with him. See, the real problem is when we are no longer being persecuted or have anything worth suffering for in our lives. This is when we need to worry. Maybe you have hid your faith in your workplace or in your neighborhood. Maybe you've hid it in other ways. Let me tell you right now, stop doing that. Let everyone know who you are and what you stand for. You might just encourage others to do the same. I mean, you might get some heat from the world, but that's okay. That's when we as Christians really get to start living. Now let's keep going in this chapter. Let's look at my favorite verse in this chapter. It's verse 8. I really like this one, and it says this: above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Isn't that interesting? In light of these last days, how much more important is it to love those that you're going to spend eternity with? In light of eternity, we must have fervent love for one another. Jesus himself said this in John 13, verses 34 through 35. He says this, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you, and that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, Jesus doesn't make this a suggestion that we could follow as long as the brothers and sisters that we're dealing with are not mean or rude. This is a commandment. Be fervent in your love for one another. Now, all of us watched this election cycle as Christians berated each other over differences. Social media blasting each other because they didn't agree. Yet God calls for his people to take care for and love each other. You know, the truth is we've fallen far from this as Christians. Peter says that this love will cover a multitude of sins. And if you have your ESV Bible and you look down at your study notes, you'll see what Grudem says. He says this, he says this, "Where love abounds in a fellowship of Christians, many small offenses and even large ones are readily overlooked." Hold on a second, I got to make sure. Are looked and forgotten. "But where love is lacking, every word is viewed with suspicion. Every action is liable to misunderstanding and conflicts about to Satan's perverse desire." That's heavy right there. Let's be more focused on love and unity for our fellow believers. Let's love them in such a way as to cover a multitude of sins. Let's attempt to love like Christ loved. And also, let's no longer avoid the sufferings of Christ. Let's embrace them and arm ourselves to his purpose. I hope you had a good time in 1 Peter 4 and are looking forward to tomorrow as we dive into chapter 5.